Hello, in this video we're going to answer the question, what is the difference between sine and sine law? So when you first learned trigonometry, you would have explored right angle triangles. And so I have a right angle triangle here, and you develop what's called your primary trig ratios. And your primary trig ratios are ratios that relate the length of sides in a specific angle. But the important thing to remember is you always have to talk about your perspective. So imagine that I'm standing right here. So I'm talking about this perspective of the triangle from this angle right here. So let's call this vertex. Let's call this vertex Y. Let's call this vertex X. And let's call this vertex R. So what happens is if I'm standing right here, if I go directly across this triangle, this is called the opposite side. And if we're using triangle naming convention, this vertex, if this is vertex Y, this would be side small case y. If I go right here, from my perspective, this side is adjacent. And again, if I use my triangle naming convention, if this is vertex X, this would be length X. And my right angle is named R, so this is length small r. And it's a hypotenuse. So we learn our primary trig ratios, and our primary trig ratios are there's three of them. And the first one is sine. So if we say sine of, for in this case, sine of y, because that's the angle we're talking about, sine is always defined as the opposite over the hypotenuse. Let's just put this in here so we know r is the hypotenuse. So based on this diagram, we can write it as y over r. Cosine of y is defined as the adjacent over the hypotenuse, which is x over r. And tan of angle y is equal to the opposite over the adjacent, which is y over x. So these are what are called your primary trig ratios. So when I say I'm taking the sine of an angle, I'm essentially figuring out what that primary trig ratio is for that right angle triangle. So this works for wonderful questions such as this. So for example, I could say find angle A for, and then let's draw a triangle. And you know, I'm going to make this one work nicely because I'm just kind of doing this on the fly here. So there's angle A. Let's make that 1, let's make that 2. If that's 1 and 2, this will be root 3. So therefore, if we want to find angle A, I'm going to say sine of A is equal to the opposite, which is 1, over the hypotenuse, which is 2. So therefore, if I want to find out what A is, I take what's called the sine inverse. And take a look, you'll see on your calculator you have a sine button, and there's a sign with a -1, which looks like an exponent. That's not sine to the -1, it said sine inverse. And you end up with A is equal to 30 degrees. So now what happens is I can take the sine of this angle and I can end up with the ratio. So the sine of angle A is 1/2. So sine of A is 1/2. Okay, so that's kind of where you usually start for trigonometry. Now, what people quickly realized was that this is great, but the reality is triangles aren't always nice right triangles. We might have a triangle like this. And let's call this triangle ABC. So the problem here is I can't take the sine of A easily because this is not a right angle triangle. So one way to make a right angle triangle is to go from C is to drop a perpendicular straight down like this. We'll call that H. So now I could take the sine of A. The sine of A would be H over B. The sine of B would be H over A. The sine of C would be, well, that would be a little bit harder because now we'd have to figure out what this length is because, well, what would be angle C? Would it be the angle in there? Would it be the angle in here? A little trickier. So what we come up with after some playing around with math is what's called sine law. And sine law specifically is a law that can be used on any triangle. And sine law states that the length over sine of the opposite angle is equal to the length of sine. Sine law states that all of these ratios are equal. So what sine law allows me to do is I can apply sine law to any triangle. So to answer your question, when we talk about what's the difference between sine and sine law, when we say the sine of an angle, I'm asking for the ratio of the opposite over the hypotenuse. Whereas if I talk about sine law, I'm talking about a law that's been developed using the properties of the primary trig ratios in order to solve non-right angle triangles. I hope that helped.